So today I'm going to be talking about worker burnout and its relationship to executive decisions and management ethics in times of crisis. And I'm going to be looking at it using a case study of Malden Mills. I think we're all pretty familiar with the idea that burnout has been a huge issue during the COVID-19 pandemic, but it's been an issue since long before that. I think it's just that the pandemic has exacerbated the effects. And one of the interesting things is that in a very kind of like neoliberal way, the responsibility for burnout has been, is generally talked about as being the responsibility of the worker versus looking at how the company has created an environment in which burnout is like a normal thing or an expected outcome. But more and more, the research is showing that burnout is about the decisions of the company and not necessarily an individual phenomenon. I think it's clear that like the kinds of decisions that are being made by management in order to increase their profits and all that kind of stuff, and their kind of self-preservation instinct in which executives pay themselves exorbitant bonuses and things like that, even in times of crisis, while having to lay thousands of people off, inherently tell people that they're less valuable, and also leads to a culture in which burnout is really prevalent. A case study that shows kind of the opposite of that, I think, in many ways, is Malden Mills, which was a textile mill that was operational from 2014 in Lawrence, Massachusetts. And Malden Mill was owned by this guy, Aaron Fierstein, who was the third generation owner of this Boston-based or Massachusetts-based mill, textile mill. Now, he was operating this company in a time when American manufacturing was in the final stages of being completely hollowed out and taken apart by private equity and all that stuff due to outsourcing. But because he felt such a deep connection to this company, to this mill, because this was part of his family. His grandfather had founded this mill at the turn of the century. He continued to operate it. One thing that allowed him to continue to run the company was that Malden Mills had created Polar Fleece, which is a proprietary technology used by LL Bean in Patagonia and others. It's like a kind of windproof, waterproof kind of coating. And one of the things that he really believed in was like ethically running a company. In this quote, he was talking about his grandfather always paying his workers before sunrise as dictated by the Torah. In this passage that he recites from in Deuteronomy, he said, it says, "You should not oppress the worker. He is poor and needy, whether he be thy brethren or a stranger. And the very day of his work, you have to pay him his wages. And the sunset should not appear upon these unpaid wages because he can't afford it. And he would cry out against you to God, and you would have sinned." I think this kind of ethical business leadership really is what kind of led to the extraordinary case where when Malden Mills was randomly burned down due to a fire in 1995, he continued to operate the company and pay his employees' wages, all 3,000 employees, for 3 months while he rebuilt. His reasoning was that, why should the workers have to suffer? And he was under immense pressure, but because of his resilience, because of his faith, and because of his belief in the company and his dedication to his family's legacy, he kept the place open. Unfortunately, he also accrued a huge amount of debt in this time, or the company did. And by 2003, the company was forced to declare bankruptcy when it was restructured and reorganized until it then, and operated for a while until it then declared bankruptcy again in 2008, when it restructured as Polar Tech, primarily around the Polar Fleece Company. or on the polar fleece product. And so it's an interesting case because, you know, the employee burnout part of it, like he didn't lose any employees, but this was also part of his downfall in many ways. You know, there were many clear decisions that he made that kind of led to the eventual bankruptcy that were not necessarily related to him continuing to pay his employees. One of them was, for example, continuing or focusing on rebuilding the flocking part of their business, which is like a kind of like high volume, low margin service slash product that's used by the furniture industry or upholstery. And, you know, this was because 500 workers of the 3,000 were involved. Whether or not like that's an ethical decision, because, you know, if the goal is to continue to employ people, then the company has to survive, right? You know, it may not have been worth it to focus on that while the company was still regaining its feet after the huge fire. Another one is kind of resisting automation, even though in opposition to his advisors, while they were rebuilding, he believed that like it should be continuously like fully operated by people. And you know, there's a certain level of certain level to which you can admire that, but you know, if the business goes under, then all the people are out of their jobs eventually. And so, you know, that's kind of an interesting part. I think it's really interesting to think about how his faith, you know, allowed him to do something so extraordinary and different from virtually all businesses at the time. And at the same time, how it kind of contributed to the demise of the company as a whole. I think one interesting effect of this story, you know, because it was a national story when this happened in the 90s, was that businesses, you know, MBA types especially, looked at this case and kind of, you know, wholesale said that like, okay, well, this is a clear example of why having ethics in business doesn't work. But you know, the fact that there are clear decisions that he made that, you know, were about him being kind of stubborn and again sticking to this kind of deontological reasoning of, you know, I shouldn't hurt any single one of my employees, even if it means that eventually the whole business is going to go under and then all the employees are going to lose their jobs. I think is part of what led to that. So the kind of like black and white reading of this case is pretty interesting and something to dive more into. And lastly, I think, again, speaking to the idea of burnout, the whole thing is that, you know, he put the employees first, he put his company first and recognized his responsibility, right? That part of the reason, if you think about why, you know, on a logical level, why an executive or an owner gets paid so much money is because they are taking on the risk, right? And inherently that should technically mean that they also, in times of crisis, should bear the brunt of, you know, the bad fortune that falls upon the company. However, you know, most people, you know, our structures of the economy are not based like that. I think it's really interesting also to kind of think about what he says here. You know, the source of quality, he said, is the blue collar workers, the doers, not just the engineers and the thinkers. You know, basically his point is that quality, right, like from a technical aspect, is a function of how you treat your workers. And I think from that point, it's interesting to consider, you know, that perhaps how a worker is treated, how people on the assembly line is treated, is a design consideration, is a technical specification that is spec'd out by the design. In the same way that like a tolerance is a tolerance for a part of the length of a part, for example, can be spec'd out. You know, I think like treatment of workers is often treated as kind of this like marketing thing, but I think it's more fundamental to the actual object itself, and he's really talking about that here. And so I think that this idea that modern companies are taking of like designing tools to mitigate burnout is the wrong approach, because it will always be a band-aid solution that eventually rips off. Don't design tools to mitigate burnout. Design better companies. Thank you.